So this is the first in a series called Almost Episodes. And the idea is for them to be quick one-off episodes that I can deliver in a shorter amount of time, and thus publish in between my monthly biography series. But they serve another purpose as well. In a way, they'll keep the people I've come to love through research from being left behind. When I begin research for a potential subject, my first sources are, of course, the easy ones, internet articles, blogs, and yes, even Wikipedia, be still my heart. Once I have that raw outline of something, it's then time for me to remove everything that's not David, so to speak. I then go on the hunt for an authoritative source, usually a published book by some historian who actually uses primary sources. But sometimes there just isn't enough meat on the bones of the subject to take it to the next step. And sometimes there just aren't any authoritative sources either. Sometimes all we have is just legend. Whichever the reason that causes me to abandon these subjects, the point is they end up getting left on the cutting room floor, if you will. This series, hopefully, if it appeals to an audience, will be my little way of resurrecting those abandoned subjects. And so, off we go with episode 1. Last year, my wife and I were on the hunt for our second home, and we looked at a house just over the Michigan border in a little township called White Pigeon. We ended up not buying the house, but that's another story. And as we drove around White Pigeon, we were trying to get a sense of the place. We wanted to make sure that this was a town that we would enjoy living in. And as we did this, I became curious about the name of the little town. White Pigeon is, after all, sort of a strange name. And I did a quick Google search and immediately came across the Indian chief namesake for the town, Chief White Pigeon. Or, in the native tongue, Chief Wabamimi, and my apologies for the likely butchering of that pronunciation. White Pigeon's story blew me away, but like so many, quote, wilderness meets civilization stories, end quote, it's a blend of legend and fact. So I'll start with setting up the scene with what we know, and then I'll end with the legend. The area that came to be known as White Pigeon, as well as the greater northern Indiana and southern Michigan area, began to be settled by white merchants and missionaries around the late 18th century. And if you're not familiar with this area, the St. Joseph River winds its way through much of this land and must have served as an attractive potential trade highway. After the Americans' victory over the British in the War for Independence, you begin to see an early version of Manifest Destiny take hold, as the Americans were quite determined to push further west. To resist this push, the Indian tribes in these areas formed a loose alliance called the Northwest Indian Confederation. It was led by a chief named Little Turtle, and made up of Shawnee, Delaware, Ottawa, Ojibwa, Miami, and Potawatomi. The last group, the Potawatomi, they were the dominant tribe in this northern Indiana and southern Michigan area. And today, people who live here are very familiar with the Potawatomi. They're still very much a presence. Our subject, Chief White Pigeon, was chief of a group of Potawatomi in the area that came to be known as White Pigeon. I believe it was called Oak Openings at the time. One source said that this group kept the weeds and grass clear so that Oak Openings could serve as a stopover on a trail that stretched from what is modern-day Detroit to what is modern-day Chicago. Basically, U.S. Highway 12, a trek that I make weekly via rental car. Now, Little Turtle and his alliance, in theory, had the support of the British Empire behind them. But as the British got deeper into a war with France, they became less interested in deviating resources to the aid of the Indians. And the last thing that empire needed right now was to get drawn into another war with the Americans. It just had no geopolitical gain for them. Nonetheless, Little Turtle resisted the westward settlers with force. Military expeditions sent by the young American government was often met with defeat. But Little Turtle's fortunes changed when President George Washington appointed a new general to crush the Indian resistance, a man named Mad Anthony Wayne. Wayne and Little Turtle fought a pivotal battle that came to be called the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which is near modern-day Toledo, Ohio. The result of the battle was a scattering of Little Turtle's forces, and without a unified army or British support, the Native Americans had no other choice but to meet the Americans at the bargaining table. And the result was an agreement known as the Treaty of Greenville, which is also the first factual evidence we have of Chief White Pigeon, as he was one of the signers on the Indian side of this treaty. And I'll read the Encyclopedia Britannica's account of the treaty, as they sum it up better than my own rambling could. Quote, "On August 3rd, 1795, Wayne, Little Turtle, and their delegations met at Fort Greenville, now Greenville, Ohio, to conclude the treaty. Both sides agreed to a termination of hostilities and an exchange of prisoners, and Little Turtle authorized the redefinition of the borders between the United States and the Indian lands. By the terms of the treaty, the Confederation ceded all lands east and south of a boundary that began at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River in modern-day Cleveland and extended south to Fort Lorenz, modern Bolivar, Ohio, and then west to Fort Recovery. The boundary then continues southwest to the point at which the Kentucky River emptied into the Ohio River, modern Carrollton, Kentucky. In addition, the United States was granted strategically significant parcels of land to the north and west of this line, including the sites of modern-day cities of Fort Wayne, Indiana, Lafayette, Indiana, Chicago, Peoria, Illinois, and Toledo, Ohio. The treaty also ceded the Mackinac Islands and its environs, as well as a large tract of land encompassing much of the area of modern metropolitan Detroit. After the signing of the treaty, Little Turtle advocated cooperation with the United States, but he was roundly criticized by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who stated that the so-called peace chiefs had given away land that they did not own. Although Tecumseh led a brilliant campaign against the Americans during the War of 1812, his death in 1813 and the disintegration of his pan-Indian Confederacy spelled the effective end of organized Indian resistance in the Northwest." End quote. Now, Chief White Pigeon apparently appears on the record again as being arrested by the American Army in 1815, which probably means he was an active participant on the side of the British in the War of 1812. And you might expect that Chief White Pigeon may harbor nothing but hatred for the American settlers pushing west at this point. Lord knows he had good reason. After all, he was a leader witnessing the utter upheaval of his people's way of life. And I'm not sure I would handle a complete and forced disintegration of my culture with much grace or stoicism. Despite these very human proclivities, Chief White Pigeon, by all accounts, chose a path of peace with the settlers of his domain. And what's more, it seems quite evident that the friendship between the two peoples was very real and trusting and treasured, and it's rather profound when you step back and think about it. Now, this is where the legend begins. There are no actual verifiable sources for what happens next, but it remains a very potent and long-held oral tradition, even today, by the people who live in White Pigeon, Michigan. Sometime around 1826, a meeting of Indian chiefs was called in Detroit, which White Pigeon attended. There, he either overheard, espied, or otherwise became privy to plans for a group of Indians to attack the white settlers in his area, his friends. At hearing this, Chief White Pigeon, it's said, ran all the way from Detroit to his home, 150 miles, which, again, is a drive that I make weekly, and it takes roughly 2 hours to do by highway, and that's if I'm going the speed limit. He ran without stopping for food, water, or rest to deliver the urgent news to the settlers, and he warned them of the impending attack, and then, overcome by exhaustion, he became sick and died shortly after. Now, there's no account of any battle that ever took place. Perhaps after losing the element of surprise, the Indian group decided against an attack, but who knows? Nonetheless, in honor of their great friend, the settlers named their new town after the man who had given his life to save theirs. Unfortunately, he was either buried on private property, which I know is ironic, or his burial site came to be private property. But history is a funny thing. And apparently, against the warnings from the Potawatomi, a cabin was built on top of Chief White Pigeon's grave. This cabin builder had obviously not seen the movie Poltergeist. Shortly after the completion of his cabin, it burned to the ground, either by angry Indian spirits or a rightfully pissed off Potawatomi contemporary. White Pigeon's legend is contested by some people and attested to by others. But before you totally discount the importance of an unprovable legend, let's remember another legend, somewhat similar, but about 2,300 years earlier. If you've ever run a marathon and felt like you were going to die, there's good reason for that. The first guy to run a marathon did die. His name was Pheidippides, and the legend says that he ran from the Battle of Marathon to Athens to announce the defeat of the great Persian Empire. After declaring the tremendous news, Pheidippides dropped dead from exhaustion, and ever since then, humanity has been running marathons. Today, you can visit Chief White Pigeon's grave, as it's an official historic site. The website mishmarkers.com describes the unveiling of the monument that sits there. Quote, in 1909, members of the Alba Columba Club, a White Pigeons women's group, raised funds and community support to create this monument to Chief Wabamimi, White Pigeon. The owner of the burial site, John Weaver, with the help of his sons and neighbors, loaded the granite boulder onto a wagon at the Edison M. Rockwell Farm in Porter Township, Cass County. 4 horses pulled it 10 miles to this site, and on August 10, 1909, a day-long celebration marked the occasion of the dedication of Wabamimi's memorial. 4,000 people, including Lieutenant Governor Patrick H. Kelly, watched as Chief Wabamimi's great-great-grandson, Willie White Pigeon, age 6, unveil the finished monument. End quote. How cool is that? And the granite boulder that sits there, as a reminder for this man who gave his life for these people, has the following inscription, quote, in memory of Wabamimi, Chief White Pigeon, who about 1830 gave his life to save the settlement at this place, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends.